Okay, well, hello everyone, and welcome to Learning from Home, and welcome to the Hewlett-Woodmere Public Library's profile on Truman Capote, whose centennial we celebrate this year. My name is Dr. Bill Thierfelder, and I'll be your host today. Now, for those of you who don't know me, I'm a retired professor of arts and humanities and docent emeritus from the American Museum of Natural History in New York, of course. I live here, though, in Portland, Oregon, where I'm speaking to you from today, and where I'm an artist, writer, and lecturer. But I do get a chance to return regularly to New York, where I continue my work at the museum and enjoy the wonders of the Big Apple. Now, since we can't cover everything about today's topic in one presentation, I invite you to take a deeper dive on my website, makingwings.net, and you're going to take deeper dive number 5. Let me demonstrate for you. So that's makingwings, one word, .net. And if you click on that, we should be seeing my website there. And only because I get a little paranoid, I want to make sure. There we are. Please go to the little drop-down box here, these little 3 dashes up in the upper right corner. You will get a drop-down. Please feel free to visit any of these, but for today's purposes, you want to go to the arrow next to Deeper Dives. Click on that. Now you're going to find a lot of things here. These are programs that I have either given recently or will be giving, but for today's purposes, we're going to number 5, Truman Capote. And again, you can visit any of those you want. For today, we're going to Truman Capote. And on this page, I provide you a bit of an overview of his life, and then some recommended reading and print resources, as well as some video resources about his life. And I've also provided you a bibliography of his work from his first story in 1945, named Miriam, to the final posthumous collection, The Early Stories of Truman Capote. And by the way, with any of these, so let's say you wanted to go to the Wikipedia biography of Capote, you just click that on, you'll be brought to the page, you can read it, and when you're done, you just click it off, and then you're back on my website. So it's one-stop shopping. So lots of great material there, and I hope that you can take advantage of it. I'd like to say that everything that you hear in this program today uses the web resources and books that you just saw on my website. But for this presentation, I especially used the following sources to build its structure and its script: Wikipedia, Britannica, SparkNotes and eNotes, and the National Endowment for the Arts and Literary Hub. Now, one of the things that you did also see on my website was suggested media. If you don't have a paper and pencil handy right now, you can always go to my website to copy these titles down. 2 books that I highly recommend are Gerald Clark's 1988 biography, which is still considered by most scholars to be the definitive exploration of Capote's life. George Plimpton's 1997 book, titled Truman Capote, has a very lengthy subtitle in which various friends, enemies, acquaintances, and detractors recall his turbulent career. But that kind of tells it all. As Kirkus Review puts it, Plimpton's book is, quote, an A-list gabfest filled over the brim with 3 things Capote cared about deeply: gossip, name dropping, and himself. Now, this is not a traditional biography by any means, but it is a thorough account of Capote's life as seen through the eyes of dozens of people who knew Capote well and best. I highly recommend it. And then you have Ralph Voss's excellent 2011 book that focuses on Capote's masterpiece In Cold Blood and the impact it had on American and world literature. Now, for those of us of a certain age, and for those of us who are New Yorkers, Truman Capote's 1966 black and white ball at the Plaza Hotel remains legendary. Deborah Davis's 300-page book, Party of the Century, published in 2010, gives you every detail and ends up being a terrific biography of the writer himself. Now, we'll be talking more about that particular social event a little later in the program. Then there's Lawrence Leamer's book, Capote's Women, which came out in the fall of 2021. Its subtitle tells it all: a true story of love, betrayal, and a swan song for an era. Babe Paley, Slim Teeth, CZ Guest, they were the stars of 50s and 60s society, especially New York society. They were also the women Truman Capote loved, flattered, and ultimately betrayed. Leamer's book is a fascinating look at their world and about the novel about them that Capote never finished. And again, we'll talk about that unfinished novel in greater detail a little later. That book and Capote's Women became one of the sources for the 2024 miniseries Feud, Capote versus the Swans, in which Tom Hollander channels Truman alongside an all-star cast of fabulous women. It's the Real Housewives on steroids and is both delicious fun and tragically sad. So for this program, I'm going to focus a little on Capote's biography. Indeed, you can learn much more by going to my website and exploring in that deeper dive number 5. Then I'm going to look at 8 highlights from that life. And finally, I'm going to tease you with 12 noteworthy books that I think are really worth reading. So as the curtains part, we see one of Elliot Erwitt's photos of Capote reveling in his remarkable black and white ball in 1966. Yeah, unfortunately, after hours of going down the internet rabbit hole, I haven't been able to identify his partner in this photo. But she does give you a sense of how the glitterati decked themselves out in high fashion couture and million-dollar jewelry. What I'd like to do now is show you a very short biography of this little firecracker that you can find on the Biography Channel's website. I provided the link for you in that deeper dive number 5 on my website. You may have to adjust the sound on your devices, and the closed captions are often very poor, but that's kind of typical of YouTube. Sorry about that, but for those who like the closed captioning, I do provide it. So this is Biography Channel. Come on, there we go. Go.
Truman Capote is admired not only because he's a great writer who crafted a beautiful prose style, but because he was also an entertaining writer who could write in a variety of different genres.
Known as the pioneer of the true crime novel, Truman Capote was both a renowned author and a controversial celebrity.
He was a brilliant self-publicist. He was able to turn himself into a celebrity, even before there was really enough good writing to back up this reputation.
On September 30th, 1924, Truman Capote was born Truman Streckfus Persons in New Orleans, Louisiana.
He was a semi-orphaned boy, in a sense. He was living with relatives in Monroeville, Alabama, and he started at the age of 11 to write short stories.
At 18, Capote wrote Miriam, which won him the 1946 prestigious O. Henry Award for Best First Published Story.
He had successes in the women's magazines of the 1940s, but a lot of this is also the mystique that Capote created about himself. His flamboyancy and his doggedness got him that attention.
In 1948, Capote published his first novel, Other Voices, Other Rooms, which became a New York Times bestseller for 9 weeks and sold more than 26,000 copies.
Other Voices, Other Rooms is essentially Truman Capote's autobiography. It was a brilliant first novel and one of the great debut novels in modern American literature.
Capote followed his success with a variety of works, including his most popular novella, Breakfast at Tiffany's.
Truman Capote was very lucky because Breakfast at Tiffany, with Hepburn in that lead role, became such an iconic character that it will last forever and ever. The film probably exceeds the possibilities of the novella itself.
In 1966, Capote created an international bestseller with the nonfiction novel In Cold Blood.
When the Clutters were first killed, only a small article appeared in the New York Times. The media did not grab onto the story. It was Capote's going to Kansas and writing about it and really publicizing the crime that caught the public's attention.
We really come to understand the criminal mind, and we get a feel for the family who are murdered in the Kansas farmhouse. The setting, the characters, all of the techniques one would expect to see in a novel are put into play in this brilliant piece of nonfiction.
In his decline, Capote suffered from alcohol and drug addiction and eventually succumbed to liver cancer on August 25, 1984, at the home of Johnny Carson's ex-wife, Joanne.
Although Capote was one of the great writers of his generation, unfortunately, after In Cold Blood was published, he never wrote anything of importance ever again. And many people will always remember him as an alcoholic who used to hang out in his pajamas at Studio 54 and go on talk shows and dish the dirt about celebrities.
Truman Capote is more than the sum of his parts. He's more than simply the writing on the page. Truman Capote is an iconic figure, a symbol of something that went strangely right or strangely wrong in American cultural life.
And I think that's a very fair mini biography. There's obviously so much more, and again, you can go to my website for a deeper dive, and I'm going to give you more of a deeper dive in a little bit. What I'd like to do is look at 8 highlights from Capote's life, some of which were included in the video we just saw, and some that were omitted. And curiously, one of the things that the video omitted was one of the great friendships of Capote's early life, namely Harper Lee. Lee, of course, was the author of To Kill a Mockingbird. And now, 2 of the most famous American authors of the 20th century, they bonded as children in the Depression era Deep South. Now, although she was 2 years younger, Lee acted as Capote's protector, shielding the tiny, highly sensitive boy from the neighborhood bullies. Lee would later say that she and Capote were united by common anguish over their childhoods, as Capote's troubled mother repeatedly abandoned him as she sought financial security, and Lee's mother suffered from what scholars now believe to be bipolar disorder. Where Lee really comes into the forefront is in late 1959. As you just heard in that video, in November of the year, Capote read a brief story in the New York Times about the brutal murder of a wealthy family in a small Kansas town. Intrigued, he pitched the idea for an investigative story at the New Yorker magazine, whose editor quickly agreed. As Capote made plans to head west, he realized that he might need an assistant. Now, as it turned out, Harper Lee had just finished submitting her final manuscript for To Kill a Mockingbird to her publishing house, and so she had some time on her hands, and so she went along with him, and so she was both his sidekick and, oh boy, much more. Lee indeed proved invaluable as her comforting Southern manner helped blunt Capote's more flamboyant personality, which didn't exactly go over well with some of the people of Kansas. Decades later, many in the town of Holcomb, Kansas, which is where the murder took place, still recall Harper Lee with great fondness, while seemingly holding Capote at arm's length. Well, thanks to Lee, back in the 1959-60 era, local residents, law enforcement, and friends of the slain Clutter family opened their doors to this very unlikely pair. Meanwhile, To Kill a Mockingbird was published in July of 1960 and became a runaway success, earning Lee a National Book Award and a Pulitzer Prize, followed by an Academy Award winning motion picture. It would eventually sell more than 30 million copies and became a beloved classic. Well, Capote's jealousy over Lee's financial and critical success gnawed at him, leading to a growing rift between the two. As Lee would write to a friend many years later, I was his oldest friend, and I did something Truman could not forgive. I wrote a novel that sold. He nursed his envy for more than 20 years. And I would add, especially when he didn't win the Pulitzer Prize for In Cold Blood. It was on a short list, but it didn't win. Harper's novel did, Capote's novel didn't. So with that, it exploded into total jealousy. Further, some, including Lee, at least in private, criticized his willingness to alter facts and situations to fit the narrative of his book In Cold Blood. In fact, some people say he told outright whoppers. But she would, people have forgiven that, I guess, over time. Harper Lee would later describe Capote in a letter to a friend, noting, I don't know if you understood this about him, but his compulsive lying was like this. If you said, did you know JFK was shot? He'd easily answer, yes, and I was driving the car he was riding in. Well, despite her years of work and her unending public support of Capote's work, he did not officially recognize her many contributions to In Cold Blood and didn't even mention her once in the book's acknowledgement section. Lee was deeply hurt by this omission, and their friendship remained in tatters for the rest of Capote's life. But this is what happened with most of Capote's relationships. They were close, and then they blew up. Now, number two on my list of highlights are all those controversial photos of Capote, especially those in his early career. Capote's first published novel, Other Voices, Other Rooms, made the New York Times bestseller list and stayed there, as you heard in the video, for 9 weeks. The promotion and controversy surrounding this novel catapulted Capote to fame. A 1947 Harold Halma picture, photograph, used to promote the book, you see that on your screen, showed a reclining Capote gazing fiercely into the camera. The picture caused as much comment and controversy as the novel itself. Truman claimed that the camera had caught him off guard. Oh, but in fact, he had posed himself and was responsible for both the picture and the publicity around it. Much of the early attention to Capote centered on different interpretations of what this and other photographs, like the one I've just popped up there on your left, there was a lot of controversy about them. They were sometimes viewed as both suggestive and provocative. Now, according to Capote's biographer, Gerald Clark, this photo by the famous Henri Cartier-Bresson created an uproar and gave Capote not only the literary, but also the public personality he had always wanted. And this one, taken by Carl van Vechten, promoted the strange and mysterious that Capote loved. Now, of all of Capote's major fictional works, it was Breakfast at Tiffany's that truly captured the general public's imagination, especially after the 1961 film version with Audrey Hepburn appeared. Now, you heard about that in the video. What you didn't hear was that Capote did not like the casting of Hepburn as Holly Golightly. And we're going to talk much more about that in a little bit. Now, I am sure, however, that he did love every ounce of the publicity that it gave his book, and certainly the royalties and the retainers that he got from the film. I'm sure he didn't complain. So, if you've only seen the film, I highly recommend the grittier, less sentimental novel. It's really quite wonderful. Now, if Breakfast at Tiffany's was one of Capote's most endearing fictional works, In Cold Blood became his most noted nonfiction work, and the one that most scholars, critics, and readers consider his masterpiece. And as you can see, I put number 4 there. At the center of that masterpiece was Capote's relationship with one of the murderers, Perry Smith. Now, we'll talk more about this book in a little while, but for now, we'll focus on this strange relationship that proved to be typical of Capote. Capote's relationship with Perry Smith was typically self-serving. At first, the writer literally fell in love with his bad boy subject and promised Smith that he would show the murderer's human side to the world in his book. But once the interviews were over, Capote just outright abandoned Perry, and frankly, he longed for Perry's execution so that his book could have a clear-cut ending, a clear-cut resolution. Now, though Capote interviewed the other murderer, Richard Hickok, it was the darkly handsome Perry Smith who became the apple of Capote's eye. Brilliantly portrayed by Robert Blake in the 1967 award-winning film version of the novel, and by Clifton Collins in the biopic Capote in 2005, Perry Smith became the ultimate unrequited lover as far as Capote was concerned. Coming in at number 5 of our 8, there's Jack Dunphy. When he met Capote in 1948, Dunphy had just written John Fury, a very well-received novel, and was just getting over a painful divorce from the dancer Joan McCracken. In 1950, the two writers settled in Sicily in a home where the author D.H. Lawrence had once lived. 10 years older than Capote, Dunphy was in many ways Capote's opposite. He was as solitary as Capote was exuberantly social. Though they drifted more and more apart in later years, because Capote was never faithful either emotionally or physically, the couple did stay together until Capote's death. In fact, when Capote died in 1984, his will named Dunphy as the chief beneficiary. 8 years later, Dunphy died of cancer at the age of 77. Dunphy and Capote owned separate houses on Long Island, New York, in the seaside hamlet called Sagaponack. Following their deaths, some of the money from their estates was donated to the Nature Conservancy, which used it to acquire nearby Crooked Pond on the Long Island Greenbelt between Sag Harbor and Bridgehampton. And their mingled ashes were scattered by the pond, where a marker commemorates them. Now, we've already spoken of it, but the black and white ball in November of 1966 at the New York Plaza Hotel was not only the social event of the decade, but it was really the emotional high point of Capote's life. And why did Capote throw the black and white ball? It was sheer impulse. He was at the height of his popularity, both as an author and as a public figure, thanks to the publication of his nonfiction novel In Cold Blood earlier that year. And he wanted to celebrate, himself mostly. The personally assembled guest list was whittled down to a quote unquote mere 540 invitees, including the likes of Frank Sinatra, Mia Farrow, Babe Paley, and Jacqueline Kennedy's younger sister, Lee Radziwill, to name just a few. If you were a name, you were invited. It was glitterati on steroids. What I'd like to show you is a very fine overview of the event from the CBS network show Sunday Morning. You have to adjust the sound on your devices, and once again, oh, the YouTube closed captioning, not the best. But for those who like closed captioning, it's something. But this will give you much more of a background into this remarkable event, really the high point of Capote's life.
It may have been the most glamorous and exclusive event ever held in New York City. Mo Rocca looks back at the infamous black and white ball and its provocative host.
Good heavens, here comes John Kenneth Galbraith. The Maharani of Baroda is here, and the Baroness de Rothschild and Mrs. Lowell Guinness.
In November 1966, a parade of bold-faced names, dressed in their finest, peacocked their way into New York's Plaza Hotel, as CBS News correspondent Charles Kuralt, in his classic reporter's trench coat, set the scene.
And if those names don't mean anything to you, presumably you are not in the other half, and you will be interested in this little report on how the other half lives.
There was a reason a news network was covering this party. Author Truman Capote had invited 540 of his very closest friends.
Just an endless list.
Author Lawrence Leamer has written about Capote's extraordinary life, including his black and white ball.
The New York Times, the next day, published a list, the guest list. It was unheard of.
This was atypical because generally they would maybe do the list of, say, a White House state dinner.
Right.
Were people lobbying him?
It didn't work. He just loved turning people down.
Among the invited, Frank Sinatra and his then-wife Mia Farrow, Andy Warhol, Norman Mailer, Henry Fonda, and a 19-year-old model and actress.
Do you remember getting the invitation to the ball?
No, and it was an invitation that people were clawing to get.
Yeah.
It was New York at its most vicious.
Candice Bergen was one of the guests.
You knew that you'd have to get a mask.
Yes. Halston stepped in.
That would be Halston, the designer of First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy's pillbox hat.
He had designed a white mink bunny mask for Marisa Berenson.
Berenson, who became one of the highest-paid fashion models in the world. She was also at the party.
And she found something better. So Halston needed a person, and it was like, okay, you wear it, whoever you are. So I wore it.
As an author, Truman Capote is remembered for Breakfast at Tiffany's and the groundbreaking book In Cold Blood. As a personality, Capote captivated and mystified audiences in TV interviews. He also played a character not unlike himself in 1976's Murder by Death.
The victim is here at this very table at this very moment.
For Capote, the masked black and white ball was something of a social experiment.
In a masked ball, you see, for the first hours of it, before the unmasking, anybody can dance with anybody they want to or talk to anybody they want to. It's a completely free thing. And by the time the unmasking come, you made a lot of new friends. And that was the point.
The ball has been recreated in an episode of the new FX series Feud, Capote versus the Swans. The Swans were the wealthy socialite wives who confided in Capote. He would eventually betray them by revealing their secrets in writing.
It's an immensely cruel and nasty thing to do to your closest friends. It's unforgivable. How he thought they could forgive him is beyond me.
But his falling out with high society would happen later. When Capote threw his ball, he was at the height of his powers.
It was the ultimate fantasy for him. This poor little kid from Alabama could pull this off and get everybody to come there.
The very planning of the party was the talk of the town for months. The party's ostensible guest of honor, Washington Post publisher Katharine Graham.
The party was really for
Truman Capote.
Do you think that Truman had a good time at his own party?
Well, did he ever have a truly good time? I don't know. I'm sure he had a massive adrenaline rush. And obviously it was.
The one we present to the world.
Tom Hollander plays Truman Capote in the FX series, which doesn't gloss over the author's dark side.
It's carnival. It's everything I've dreamt of since I was a little boy, this kind of true nakedness.
He was addicted to alcohol. He was also addicted to high society. It made him feel good, but it was not good for him. He should have been at his desk.
What was it in his personality that compelled him to throw this party?
Well, the point and fun of having a party is who you don't invite.
A deep inferiority complex.
So much fear there.
It's all fear.
John Robin Bates wrote the series.
I always think he could have had another 25, 30 years if he had followed the advice of clean up and go into exile.
When Capote threw his ball, he was coming off the huge success of In Cold Blood. It would be the last of his books published in his lifetime. He died 18 years later at age 59.
Do you think most people there had a good time at the party?
No, I don't think people had fun, but like all things in hell, they pretended they were having a good time.
Do you think that a party could happen today and get that kind of attention?
I hope not. It's too much.
Yeah.
I think it was a huge piece of theater for Truman.
Right.
And it worked.
Would you say you had fun there?
I was overwhelmed.
Yeah.
I had to be focused. It's like, pay attention here.
Do you still have the mask?
No. I had to return the mask.
If you were rich enough, or social, or beautiful enough, you would have been here to see for yourself. And as somebody said, unkindly, if we were rich enough, or social, or beautiful enough, we wouldn't be standing out here in the halls.
Charles Kuralt, CBS News, New York.
Okay. And I love Kuralt's ending. Okay, get me the hell out of here. It's great. Okay. Now, I wanted you to see that report because the ball itself presents an insightful portrait of Capote's whole psychology. He was a brilliant writer who was deeply flawed, who needed the adulation of others to accept himself. And quite frankly, it was downhill from there. Capote never again achieved the fame or the success of 1966 or that grand party. And for the next 2 decades, he lived an often sad life that bordered on decadence. And nothing represents that downhill spiral better than named after the famous restaurant on 55th Street in Manhattan that opened in the late 1950s and operated until 2004. If Cold Blood made Truman Capote, his piece in the all of Capote's best friends' secrets, many of whom had attended that black and white ball. Now, these were not just average everyday secrets. No, they were all about the deepest and darkest elements of New York and of jet-set society. These were some of the most powerful individuals in New York in the 60s and 70s, and Capote unleashed his hounds on them. I'm not going to give anything away, so if you want the scoop, you'll just have to read the chapter. But I will say this. At the height of mid-century New York, There was nothing more glamorous and fabulous than Truman Capote's inner circle of beautiful, wealthy, socialite women whom he affectionately labeled his swans. And these swans included names like Jackie Kennedy's sister, Princess Lee Radziwill, and publisher Gloria Guinness. Even Marilyn Monroe was briefly part of his circle. What captured Capote's imagination about his swans was not necessarily the money they all possessed, but the stories they had to tell. It would ultimately be these stories that would be Capote's downfall. Why? Because he decided to make public these confidential confessions and make them public in very embellished, sometimes hyperbolic fashion. Initially, Le Cote Basque, 1965, was intended to be the 5th chapter of a novel called Answered Prayers, which was never completed. The title refers to meetings with the Swans in an A-list restaurant located across from the St. Regis Hotel. Though supposedly a piece of fiction, every one of the Swans recognized themselves, and the Swans were not amused. Once again, I totally recommend Lawrence Leamer's insightful book, Capote's Women, if you'd like to learn more about the Swans, as well as the mini-series Feud, Capote versus the Swans. And finally, number 8, which I simply call Booze, Drugs, and a Few Faithful Friends. The last 20 years of his life were filled with false starts, writer's block, lots of drugs and alcohol, drunken appearances on TV talk shows, and increasing isolation. Nearly everyone had abandoned him by the early 1980s. His dependencies, his lies, and his acerbic personality drove away acquaintances and kept most friends at an arm's length distance. It was sad to see. But a few friends, probably those who understood addiction, remained faithful. And of those, Joanne Carson, Johnny Carson's ex-wife, was the most faithful. In 2006, Joanne, who was then 75, decided to part with most of Capote's possessions that were still stored in her home. They went on auction at Bonham's in New York with simulcasts at branches in Los Angeles and San Francisco, and they made a very, very handsome sum. Now, here's what Robin Abkarian wrote in the Los Angeles Times that you can follow along. They were an unlikely pair, Joanne Carson and Truman Capote. She was the plucky, gorgeous wife of the man who would become the undisputed king of late-night television. He was the diminutive literary genius whose rapier wit would eventually force him into a kind of social exile from Manhattan. In 1971, the year before her divorce became final, Joanne moved home to California, while Johnny Carson stayed in New York, where his show was then taped. She bought a rustic house on Sunset Boulevard at the western fringe of Bel Air. Eventually, Capote would take over 2 of her 5 bedrooms, making her home his California pied-à-terre, spending months there every year, swimming and trying to write. And on August the 25th of 1984, dying in his writing room, probably from an overdose of pills. Capote was cremated and his remains were divided between Carson and Jack Dunphy. Carson bought a crypt at Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles. And as we heard earlier, the ashes left to Dunphy were eventually spread on a nature preserve on eastern Long Island. The ashes left to Joanne Carson were interred at Westwood. Thus, Capote has kind of the distinction of having 2 resting places. So Carson remained the loyal friend to the bitter end, while others abandoned Capote by droves. In fact, when hearing of Capote's death, The great novelist Gore Vidal, who had been once one of his friends, called it, quote, a wise career move. Ooh, ouch. But let's focus on the wonderful writing. This, all of this brings us to 12 works that are definitely worth exploring. Now, the average reader knows Breakfast at Tiffany's and In Cold Blood, but there are other works that are quite wonderful and certainly worth time and effort. Now, I'm approaching these works in chronological order. So, first up is Capote's breakout novel that we've been talking about, that was published in 1948. It's called Other Voices, Other Rooms. It's written in the Southern Gothic style and is notable for its atmosphere of isolation and decadence. It tells the story of 13-year-old Joel Harris Knox, a lonely, effeminate boy who is sent from New Orleans to live with his father, who abandoned him at birth. Arriving at Scully's Landing, a vast decaying mansion on an isolated plantation in Mississippi, Joel meets 5 remarkable characters. His sullen stepmother, Amy, her cousin, Randolph, a flamboyant gay man, the defiant tomboy, Idabel, a girl who becomes his friend, and Jesus and Zoo, the 2 black caretakers of the home. And the macabre adventures begin from there. And as you heard in one of our videos, a lot of this is really autobiographical, but it's fun. It's very Gothic. It's very, very interesting. Now, A Tree of Night and Other Stories is a short story collection Capote published in early 1949. All 8 narratives are beautifully written. And the most famous of these 8 stories is the ghostly tale called Miriam, that was originally published in June of 1945 in Mademoiselle magazine. It was one of Capote's first published short stories, and in 1946 earned the writer an O. Henry Award in the category of Best First Published Story. I also recommend The Grass Harp. It's a novel published in October of 1951. It tells the story of an orphaned boy and 2 elderly ladies who eventually decide to observe life from a treehouse. After several confrontations, they eventually leave their temporary retreat to make amends with each other and other members of society. Now, the success of the strange and beautiful novel inspired Capote to create a play version. The adaptation opened on March the 27th of 1952 at Broadway's Martin Beck Theater. That all-star cast included Mildred Natwick, Ruth Nelson, Jonathan Harris, Sterling Holloway, Gertrude Flynn, and Lenka Peterson. Music for the production was by the eminent American composer Virgil Thompson, and the scenery and costumes were by none less than the award-winning designer Cecil Beaton. Now, despite this remarkable pedigree, the play failed to grab a consistent audience, and it closed after only 36 performances. Now, if you can grab hold of the script, I think you'll find that actually it's a terrific little play. There's also a fine film adaptation of The Grass Harp from 1995. The screenplay was the final work of Oscar-winning screenwriter Sterling Silliphant, and it stars Piper Laurie, Sissy Spacek, Walter Matthau, Jack Lemmon, Edward Furlong, and Nell Carter. Piper Laurie would go on to win the Best Supporting Actress Award from the Southeastern Film Critics Association for her work in that film. The Los Angeles Times reviewed the film and called it a beguiling film and one that celebrates rebirth and renewal, but within a tough-minded view of life that never allows it to lapse into fairy tale. And Variety called it a sensitive screenplay adaptation and noted the film's wonderful ensemble cast. And unfortunately, despite really good reviews, the film, like the stage adaptation, did poorly at the box office. This is a shame. If you have a chance, I highly recommend it. I believe you can stream it online. Well, one of my favorites, A Christmas Memory, originally published in Mademoiselle magazine in December of 1956. It's a stunningly written story about the author and his eccentric cousin named Suki, with whom he shares several Christmas traditions, including making an infamous moonshine-laden fruitcake that is sent to everyone from their dirt-poor neighbors to President Roosevelt himself. A Christmas Memory was first adapted for television for ABC Stage 67 by Truman Capote and Eleanor Perry. The production starred Geraldine Page and Donnie Melvin, with Truman Capote as the narrator. Both the teleplay and the program star, Geraldine Page, won Emmy Awards, and the production as a whole won a Peabody Award. It's still available on DVD and can be streamed on YouTube. I love reading the story and then watching this wonderful film. It's just wonderful. And bring your Kleenex. There's also a feature film from 1997 starring Patty Duke as Aunt Suk that I think is also quite fine. Both versions have wonderful lead performances, but the earlier version has the interesting advantage of having Capote himself narrating it. Okay, we've already spoken about it, but Breakfast at Tiffany's, published in 1958, tells the story of a contemporary writer recalling his early days in New York City when he makes the acquaintance of his remarkable neighbor, Holly Golightly. Holly remains one of Capote's best known characters. The story was originally sold to Harper's Bazaar for $2,000 and intended for publication in its July 1958 issue. It was to be illustrated with a big series of photo montages by David Atty. However, after the publication was scheduled, Hearst magazine executives began asking for changes to the novella's rather, how shall I put it, tart language. Well, by this time, Atty's montages had been completed, and while Capote initially refused to make any changes, he relented. Yet, despite the revisions, the Hearst Corporation ordered Harper's not to run the novella anyway. Its language and subject matter, about a society call girl, were deemed not suitable for one of its publications. And there was concern that Tiffany's, who was a major advertiser in Hearst-owned publications, would react negatively. Well, an outraged Capote soon resold the work to Esquire magazine for $3,000, with the caveat that they use Atty's original series of photos. But to his disappointment, Esquire ran just one full-page image of Atty's work, which you can now see on your right. It's this rather interesting photo there. It's the only one of Atty's photos that was published. Atty's photo was the first ever visual depiction of Holly Golightly, who was seen laughing and smiling at a nightclub. The glowing reviews of the novella caused sales of the Esquire magazine issue to skyrocket. And Tiffany's, rather than being offended by the tale, was delighted that the piece brought in more foot traffic than it had ever seen. Well, the great success of the novella led to the making of the now classic film version starring Audrey Hepburn in one of her most iconic roles as Holly, the naive, eccentric cafe society girl who falls in love with a struggling writer played by George Peppard. It was theatrically released by Paramount Pictures in October of 1961 and received great critical acclaim and commercial success. It ended up being nominated for 5 Academy
Why,
Awards.
someone stalled? He
Excuse
got
me?
stalled?
No. Are you now seeing Breakfast at Tiffany's on your screen? It's
Yes,
moving
yes.
along. It's moving along finely by me. Nothing's stalled. Okay, well, let me continue. The film ended up winning 5 Academy Awards. Nominated for 5 Academy Awards, and it won 2, with the music, including the now famous standard Moon River, being nominated for 6 Grammy Awards and winning 5 of those. The film was selected in 2012 for preservation in the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress as being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. Now, unfortunately, and I'm assuming we have just moved to the next slide, for his portrayal of Holly's landlord, Mr. Yunioshi, Mickey Rooney was cast in the role and wore yellow face makeup and a prosthetic mouthpiece to change his features to a characterized approximation of a Japanese person. Since the 1990s, this portrayal has been subject to increasing protest, especially by Asian Americans. Years after the film was seen on screen, director Blake Edwards stated, "Looking back, I wish I had never done it, and I would give anything to be able to recast it, but it's there and onward and upward." But here's one other fascinating bit of Hollywood trivia. Capote, who sold the film rights of his novella to Paramount Studios, wanted Marilyn Monroe to play Holly Golightly, saying that Marilyn was always my first choice to play Holly Golightly. While screenwriter George Axelrod was hired to tailor the screenplay for Monroe. However, when Lee Strasberg advised Monroe that playing a lady of the evening would be bad for her image, she turned the role down, and it ended up performing in her final film, The Misfits, instead. Well, after Monroe turned down the offer, Shirley MacLaine and then Kim Novak were offered the part. When they also refused, Hepburn was cast. Capote was supposedly furious, and he remarked, "Paramount double-crossed me in every way and cast Audrey." Well, in typical Capote fashion, he pouted for years, saying that he absolutely hated Hepburn in the leading role, despite her obvious brilliance in the role and the fact that he made a ton of money off that movie. Indeed, Hepburn was a hit with critics and audiences. Indeed, the image of Holly with her hair in a high chignon carrying an oversized cigarette holder is considered one of the most iconic images of 20th century American cinema. Another iconic item throughout the movie is Holly's pair of sunglasses. And further, the little black dress by Givenchy worn by Hepburn at the beginning of the film is cited as one of the most quintessential items of clothing in the history of the 20th century and is perhaps the most famous little black dress of all time. Well, keeping up with the theme of film adaptations, The Innocents is a 1961 psychological horror film starring Deborah Kerr, Michael Redgrave, and Megs Jenkins. Based on the 1898 novella The Turn of the Screw by the American novelist Henry James, the screenplay was adapted by Capote and William Archibald, who used Archibald's own 1950 stage play, also called The Innocents, as a primary source. Its plot follows a governess who watches over 2 children and comes to fear that their large estate is haunted by ghosts and that the children are being possessed. The critic Pauline Kael called the film the best ghost movie I have ever seen, praising Capote's adaptation of the source material. The film was nominated for 2 BAFTA awards, including Best British Film and Best Film of 1961. For his direction, Jack Clayton, best known for his gritty 1959 social drama Room at the Top with Lawrence Harvey, was named Best Director by the National Board of Review. In addition, William Archibald and Truman Capote won a 1962 Edgar Award from the Mystery Writers of America for Best Motion Picture Screenplay. Now, if you've never seen it, this one is a classic. It's perfect for a cold, damp winter's evening. So as we're getting into the fall and winter season here, I definitely recommend it. Watch this on Halloween. Well, of course, then there is the trailblazing In Cold Blood, easily Capote's masterpiece. As already noted, it was first published in 1966 and details the 1959 murders of the Clutter family in the small farming community of Holcomb, Kansas. Now, as we know, Capote was mesmerized by the crime and traveled to Kansas, accompanied by his childhood friend and fellow author Harper Lee. And they interviewed residents and investigators assigned to the case and took thousands of pages of notes. Killers Richard Hickok and Perry Smith were arrested 6 weeks after the murder and later executed by the state of Kansas. Capote ultimately spent 6 years working on this book. Well, In Cold Blood was an instant success and is one of the best-selling true crime books in publishing history. It still appears on bestseller lists. Written in the style of a novel, the ostensibly nonfiction work has been lauded for its eloquent prose, extensive detail, and triple narrative, which describes the lives of the murderers, the lives of the victims, and the lives of the other members of the rural community in alternating sequences. The psychologies and backgrounds of Hickok, seen on your right in the photo on your screen, it's over there, that's the original Hickok, and Smith, you see him on your left here, are given special attention, as is the pair's complex relationship during and after the murders. In Cold Blood is regarded by critics as a pioneering work in the true crime genre, although Capote was disappointed that the book failed to win the Pulitzer Prize, that prize that his friend Harper Lee had won. Well, we now know that some of the events and conversations in the book were fabricated for dramatic effect, but the book has always been regarded, even among those criticizing it, as one of the great achievements of American literary art. Today, every true crime book that you read or true crime show that you watch on television can thank Truman Capote for almost single-handedly inventing the form. A highly regarded film version of the book was produced in 1967. It's directed by Richard Brooks and stars Robert Blake as Perry Smith and Scott Wilson as Richard Hickok. It features John Forsythe as investigator Alvin Dewey from the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, who apprehended the killers. It was nominated for 4 Oscar awards: Best Director, Best Original Score, Best Cinematography, and Best Adapted Screenplay. The author's experiences in writing that story and subsequent fascination with the murders became the focus of the film Capote in 2005, which stars Philip Seymour Hoffman as Truman Capote, Clifton Collins Jr. as Perry Smith, and Catherine Keener as Harper Lee. The film was critically acclaimed and won the 78th Academy Awards for Best Actor for Philip Seymour Hoffman. The film was also nominated for Best Picture, Best Supporting Actress for Catherine Keener, Best Director, Bennett Miller, and Best Adapted Screenplay. Dan Futterman wrote that screenplay, who you may remember playing the son of Robin Williams in the film The Birdcage. Coming in at number 8, chronologically, The Thanksgiving Visitor. It's a short story originally published in November of 1967 in an issue of McCall's magazine, and later published as a book by Random House in 1968. The book is about a boy and his problem with the town bully, who ends up being invited to Thanksgiving dinner by his beloved cousin Suki. Yes, the same Suki who was in Christmas Memory. The story has a strong moral lesson about humiliation and revenge, and it serves as a fine sequel to A Christmas Memory. Like A Christmas Memory, The Thanksgiving Visitor was made into an award-winning television film, which won another Emmy Award for Geraldine Page, reprising her role as Suki. In 1973, Capote published The Dog's Bark, and it's largely a retrospective look at Capote's life from 1942 to 1972. The title, inspired by the author André Gide, is taken from an Arab proverb: the dogs bark, but the caravan moves on. In a review of the collection in The New Yorker, Liz Harris says, it bulges with sharp, subtle observation of people, fascinating reminiscences and travel jottings, wonderful sketches, anecdotes, and yarns, and among other things, the most frightening horror story you've ever heard. Not a deep plate of soup, perhaps, but a marvelously tasty one. And I couldn't agree more with Ms. Harris. In 1988, Capote published Music for Chameleons, and it was Capote's last full-length work. The book is divided into 3 sections. Part 1, titled Music for Chameleons, includes the short story after which the section and the book are named, as well as 5 other semi-autobiographical stories. Part 2, the core of the book, consists of a single piece, Hard Carved Coffins, ostensibly a quote-unquote non-fiction account of an American crime that suggests certain parallels with his best-known work In Cold Blood. The third section, Conversational Portraits, consists of 7 essays that recall Capote's encounters with people like Pearl Bailey, Willa Cather, Marilyn Monroe, and others. One of the best pieces, called A Day's Work, is his account of the day he spent with his housekeeper as he cleans his place and the homes of other clients. It's very interesting. Now, what you see on your screen is a review. It's a review of the collection from the New York Times in August of 1980 by Christopher Lehman Howe. And he wrote, in short, the pieces in Music for Chameleons have freed him to write about himself. Yet these pieces can hardly be called an egotistical celebration of his personality. Well, he does what he does with art. That art is a sort of music. We gather to listen and to blend ourselves into the composer's background, just like chameleons. Though published in 1975, before Music for Chameleons, La Côte Basque was intended as a chapter in his novel Answered Prayers, which was published posthumously in 1986. And that's why I put it here, as one of our last pieces. By now, we know the story. Capote's swans were the most beautiful, stylish, wealthy, and envied women in all of New York. And he, Truman Capote, he was their ultimate trophy, the boy genius whose masterpiece In Cold Blood made him a national celebrity. The party boy who's sheathed the malicious gossip in gilt-edged wit, the intellectual whose friendship elevated them to his level. Well, Capote thought this story was another masterpiece to be part of his long-awaited Answered Prayers. He went so far as to tell People magazine that the novel would be filled with thinly disguised characters, people he knew. He was going to assassinate them all, his pen the gun. Well, Capote never finished his book, but in 1975, against his editor's advice, he published that completed chapter in Esquire magazine. And as we've already said in this program, the story destroyed everything: Capote's friendships, his reputation, his social standing, and his desire to write. He had slithered his way into the hearts of his swans as only a gay man could, a gay man who was far more interesting than their boring husbands. But in the end, his swans deserted him. Critics and readers alike were appalled that he so easily exposed his friends and all their scandals, from adultery to murder. And indeed, very sadly, he kind of became the, and I'm going to use the language here, of kind of the cliche of what in gay circles is called the bitch queen. The person who kind of slithers his way into your life and then abuses you. And of course, that's a horrible stereotype, and it's one that gay men definitely, truly try to overcome. Now, some of the people that he exposed in that chapter included Babe Paley, the wife of Bill Paley, the head of CBS Broadcasting; fashion designer, heiress, and socialite Gloria Vanderbilt; philanthropist and second lady of the United States, Happy Rockefeller; and perhaps most significantly and cruelly, Anne Woodward, who became a prominent figure in New York high society after her marriage to banking heir William Woodward Jr. Although never convicted, she was suspected of murdering him after she shot and killed her husband in 1955, claiming that she had mistaken him for a burglar. The circumstances surrounding her husband's death led to Woodward becoming a cause célèbre and later being banished from high society. Life called the event the shooting of the century. Well, when Capote published Le Coq Basque in 1975, he accused Woodward outright of murdering her husband. 3 weeks before the story appeared in Esquire, she killed herself by taking cyanide, and everyone in the inner circle blamed Truman. Today, after a decade of the hypocrites and strivers of the various Real Housewives programs on Bravo, not to mention those endless celebrity confessionals, this 13,000-word story seems remarkably current and in touch. If published today, we wouldn't even bat an eye. But even in post-Watergate 1975, this story made headlines and paved the way for every aspect of private lives becoming public. Today, as we know, there are no secrets allowed by our public figures. And in many ways, Capote's story marks one of the turning points in creating that reality. In the first chapter of Answered Prayers, titled Unspoiled Monsters, the unnamed narrator eviscerates a famous writer who has become a failure and a drunk eaten up by cancer. Capote gives no hint that he's talking about himself, but of course he is. That chapter includes these lines: what I thought was, here's a dumpy little guy with a dramatic mind who, like one of his own heroines, seeks attention and sympathy by serving up half-believed lies to total strangers. Strangers because he has no friends. It's probably one of the most honest autobiographical appraisals by any writer. And finally, to close out our dozen wonderful Capote books, we have Summer Crossing, which is actually Capote's first written novel. He started it in about 1943 and worked on it intermittently for several years before putting it aside. For over 50 years, Summer Crossing was thought to be lost, but it was eventually rediscovered among Capote's papers and was published in 2005, thus technically, chronologically, making it Capote's last published work. After her parents leave her alone one summer while traveling, the novel tells the story of Grady O'Neill, a spoiled young New York socialite whose romantic dalliance with Clyde Manzer, a Jewish war veteran, grows increasingly serious and dysfunctional. The novel comes to a dramatic resolution on the Queensboro Bridge, hence why I have that on your screen. Now, it's not top shelf Capote, but considering it was written when he was in his late teens and maybe 20-ish, the book already shows signs of the brilliant prose, the pointed descriptions, and the sharp dialogue we've come to love in his later work. It's always fun to discover an unknown early work by a great writer, composer, or writer, and this character's study of a troubled soul is certainly worth reading. Well, there, 70 minutes. There you have it, a complex, frustrating, sometimes lovable, sometimes hateable cauldron of a writer and a human being. Certainly, knowing a little about the man behind the literature helps to expand our understanding of those handful of literary gems. Again, please feel free to visit my website, makingwings.net, and check out a deeper dive number 5. So before we talk about next month's presentation, if anyone has some thoughts